The sky was quiet in that brief moment before dawn, the kind of silence a pilot learns not to trust. Somewhere above the cold European clouds, a single engine hummed with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. It was the Merlin, carrying a Mustang toward a war that had reshaped the world long before the sun could rise on victory or loss. For thousands of pilots, that sound meant survival, and sometimes sacrifice. It defined an era when piston fighters ruled the air, even as shadows of something faster began to creep over the horizon. But near the war's end, engineers asked a daring question. What if the Mustang could be reborn? What if the last breath of piston-powered ingenuity could push beyond everything the world had already witnessed? The answer arrived too late for battle, yet stood unmatched on paper. A machine crafted in the narrow space between triumph and obsolescence. Before jet fighters claimed the skies and closed the book on an entire generation of aviators, one aircraft emerged as the Mustang's final evolution. And history now invites us to look closer at the warrior that never had its war. The final winter of World War II carried a strange mix of exhaustion and endurance. Allied airfields across Europe were lined with rows of P-51 Mustang fighters, engines cooling beneath their cowlings after long escort missions that stretched into the heart of Germany. These pilots had lived through an unforgiving truth. Without long-range protection, bomber crews were flying toward near-certain loss. The Mustang changed that story. With its speed, endurance, and the distinctive growl of the Merlin engine, the P-51 Mustang became one of the most respected World War II fighters ever built. Yet, even as victory drew closer, a quiet realization spread through engineering rooms in Britain and the United States. The war had pushed aviation to its limit, but the limit itself was moving. Jet aircraft were already whispering about a future where piston fighters would no longer rule the sky. Engineers at North American Aviation understood that the world was changing fast. If the Mustang was to evolve, it had to evolve completely, not incrementally. This was the beginning of the Superprop fighter concept. Nations were racing to create piston-powered aircraft with performance levels unmatched by anything that had flown before. Republic brought forth the XP-72, Grumman introduced the Bearcat, and Hawker advanced toward what would become the Sea Fury. These machines were not simply upgrades. They were the final push of an era fighting against its own approaching end. Within that competition, North American sought to craft a Mustang that was not just improved, but transformed. The lightweight Mustang program emerged from this urgency. Early prototypes, known as the F and G models, explored how far the Mustang could be taken if weight, aerodynamics, and pure performance were prioritized above all else. Engineers reevaluated every structural decision, every pound of metal, every aerodynamic surface. They asked whether a Mustang could be faster, lighter, and more commanding without sacrificing the balanced handling that pilots trusted with their lives. This was not an attempt to replicate the P-51 Mustang. It was an attempt to redefine it. As the post-war landscape shifted toward the jet fighter era, North American pressed forward with a design intended to push piston technology to its final frontier. The result was the P-51H Mustang, a superprop fighter that embodied everything aviation engineers had learned from years of combat and thousands of lost aircraft. It was born not from desperation, but from ambition. The ambition to build the ultimate Mustang, before the world no longer needed Mustangs at all. The push to perfect the P-51 Mustang reached its peak when engineers turned their attention to the very shape of the aircraft. The earlier Mustang had earned fame with its laminar flow wing, but technology had not stood still. As designers prepared what would become the P-51H Mustang, they adopted the new NACA 66 series airfoil, a leap forward in high-speed aerodynamics. This redesign reduced drag that had quietly taxed the earlier P-51 Mustang at high Mach numbers, and allowed the new wing to carry the aircraft deeper into the upper limits of piston-powered flight. It was the kind of change pilots might not notice at first glance, but would feel the instant the aircraft sliced cleanly through the air at full throttle. At the heart of this refined machine sat the Merlin engine in its ultimate form, the Packard-built V16509. This version of the Merlin was not simply powerful. It was engineered for sustained power across a wide envelope of altitude and airspeed. With water methanol injection pushing the manifold pressure to 90 inches, the engine produced roughly 2,220 horsepower, allowing the P-51H Mustang to stand among the most formidable piston fighters ever conceived. More importantly, it produced this strength consistently, from sea level to the thin air above 20,000 feet. For pilots who had once prayed for every horsepower to survive a climb or an intercept, This kind of reliability meant the difference between controlling a fight and being controlled by it. Yet the real revolution was not just the engine itself, but how easily the pilot could command it. The Simmons control system simplified mixture, manifold pressure, and water injection management into a seamless operation. Earlier generations of Mustang pilots had to juggle these settings while fighting for their lives. A single mistake could cost performance or destroy the engine altogether. But in the P-51H Mustang, the workload dropped. Automation replaced anxiety. For a fighter aviator, that reduction in mental strain was not a luxury. It was survivability. Weight reduction became another battlefield in this engineering war. By studying why the Spitfire was lighter than the Mustang, designers identified dozens of opportunities to trim excess mass. A narrower fuselage, re-engineered landing gear, thinner gauge aluminum alloy, and improved structural design carved away roughly 600 pounds. In the world of fighter aircraft, 600 pounds is not a number. It is a shift in identity. It meant a lighter wing loading, shorter takeoff rolls, sharper turns, better climb, and smoother handling at the edge of the stall. Fuel management also saw a transformation. Earlier Mustangs carried a rear fuselage tank that destabilized the aircraft when full, forcing pilots to burn that fuel before combat. The P-51H Mustang corrected this flaw with a clean, stable fuel system built into the design from the start. Even with slightly reduced total capacity, its combat-ready fuel load was greater and more practical for real operations. By the time these innovations converged, the aircraft that emerged was no longer a refinement of the World War II fighter that had changed history. It was a new machine entirely, a superprop fighter built to challenge the limits of its era. On paper, the P-51H was ready to outrun, outclimb, outturn, and outrange almost any piston fighter in the world. The tragedy, as history would reveal, was that the world had already moved on. The end of World War II did not arrive with the clarity of a final bell. Instead, it brought a slow, shifting silence, a pause in which nations began to rebuild while militaries tried to understand what the future of air combat would demand. For the new P-51H Mustang, this silence was not an invitation, it was the closing of a door. By the time the P-51H reached operational readiness, the jet fighter era had already stepped onto the world stage. The Republic F-84 Thunderjet, followed quickly by the swept-wing F-86 Sabre, showcased a form of speed and altitude performance no piston-powered aircraft could match. Engineers and strategists alike recognized that even the finest superprop fighter could no longer dominate the air. The path forward belonged to jet engines, not to the careful refinements of the Merlin engine or the aerodynamic grace of the Mustang line. History had entered a new chapter, and the P-51H arrived at the very last line of the old one. When war returned in Korea, the United States faced a familiar need: a rugged, reliable aircraft for ground attack, escort, and low-altitude patrol. The P-51 Mustang was the natural choice, but the version selected was the wartime P-51D, not the refined P-51H Mustang. The reason was not performance, it was logistics. Thousands of P-51Ds remained in storage, along with parts, maintenance tools, trained crews, and combat-proven procedures. The P-51H Mustang, built in far smaller numbers, lacked the supply chain required to keep it flying in a distant theater. In war, a great machine that cannot be supported becomes a liability, no matter how promising it might look on paper. The result was a strange twist of fate. The P-51D fought and died in Korea, supporting troops on the ground and absorbing fire in dangerous close support missions. Meanwhile, the P-51H Mustang stayed home. It never felt the shock of anti-aircraft bursts beneath its wings, or the stress of a Merlin engine pushed past its limits. It never had the chance to test its promise against an enemy aircraft, or prove its worth to the pilots who might have trusted it with their lives. In the annals of air combat, many fighters were outmatched. Few were simply unused. Elsewhere in the world, piston fighters continued their twilight service for nations unable to afford jets. Surplus P-47 seconds and P-51 seconds fought over Taiwan and the Chinese mainland in the early 1950 seconds, scoring victories long after most believed their era had ended. But these battles belonged to the older Mustangs, the ones that had survived World War II, not to the sleek and capable P-51H Mustang. The last and greatest evolution of the P-51 Mustang never took part in the final conflicts of the piston age. By the time the decade closed, the world no longer asked what a piston fighter could do. The conversation had shifted entirely to jet power, radar, missiles, and the new logic of Cold War air strategy. In that transition, the P-51H Mustang became a symbol of an era overtaken not by defeat, but by time itself. As the United States adjusted to the uncertainties of the post-war world, one truth became unmistakable. Technology was no longer merely supporting strategy, it was shaping it. The P-51H Mustang, extraordinary as it was, entered service at a moment when American military thinking had turned sharply toward jet aircraft and the strategic demands of the emerging Cold War. In this new environment, even the finest piston fighter could not shift the trajectory of policy. Decisions were driven by reach, speed, and the promise of future combat dominance, not by the elegance or refinement of a superprop fighter. From a strategic standpoint, the P-51H Mustang represented a lesson the United States would encounter many times throughout the 20th century. A weapon can be near perfect, yet still be overtaken by a shift in doctrine. American aviation was accelerating toward jet propulsion, radar-guided interception, and missile-based combat. The P-51H, despite its remarkable performance, belonged to the logic of World War II fighters, not to the new frontier of supersonic air power. Across the Atlantic, the story unfolded differently. The Hawker Sea Fury, though also a piston-powered fighter, had a place carved out for it by naval necessity. The U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy each faced the complex challenge of adapting jet fighters to carrier operations. For a time, piston aircraft remained essential on the deck, and the Sea Fury proved its worth in the crucible of real combat. It fought in Korea, intercepted enemy aircraft, and struck ground targets under fire. On paper, the P-51H Mustang could surpass it in speed, climb, and range. But in war, paper comparisons matter far less than battlefield reliability, maintainability, and the trust built between a machine and its pilots. The global landscape also offers a broader perspective. Dozens of nations entered the jet age unevenly, relying on surplus P-47 seconds and P-51 seconds well into the 1950 seconds. Their skies became the last proving grounds for World War II fighters, places where the limits of piston technology were tested as politics and ideology hardened across Cold War borders. Yet, even in those struggles, the P-51H Mustang played no part. It stood as a reminder that weapons development is not simply a race of performance figures, but a negotiation between timing, strategy, and the unpredictable demands of history. In that way, the P-51H Mustang teaches a quiet lesson. Greatness in engineering does not guarantee a place in the battles that define an era. Sometimes history chooses differently. Every generation of aircraft carries a legacy, not just in metal and design, but in the stories it leaves behind. The P-51 Mustang wrote its legacy in the skies over Europe and the Pacific, where its pilots measured each mission against the weight of those who never returned. But the P-51H Mustang, the ultimate evolution of that lineage, carries a quieter legacy. It represents what happens when engineering brilliance arrives just after history has changed course. The P-51H Mustang was not denied greatness by flaws or misjudgment. It was denied by timing. It stood at the threshold between the age of the piston fighter and the dawn of jet warfare, a superprop fighter perfected at the very moment its era was ending. In the long view of military history, this is not unusual. Many remarkable weapons emerge in the narrow spaces between wars, admired for their potential but untouched by the consequences of real combat. The P-51H belongs to that select group, remembered not for what it did, but for what it could have done. And yet, its story still matters. It reminds us that technological progress moves faster than the world can absorb. It shows that even the most advanced piston-powered aircraft could not escape the shadow of the jet fighter era. And it invites us to reflect on the pilots who once placed their trust in the Merlin engine, who flew into danger knowing that every detail of design could mean survival. For them, the P-51H Mustang stands as a tribute not only to innovation, but to the long, hard-earned lineage of World War II fighters that shaped the modern air age. Some scars of history come from the battles fought, others come from the silence that follows the battles that never happened. The P-51H exists in that silence, a reminder that not all warriors meet their enemy, and not all legends are forged in fire. So now the question turns to you. Does the P-51H Mustang deserve to be remembered as the ultimate P-51 Mustang, even without a combat record? And in a hypothetical clash of piston titans, would you place your confidence in the P-51H or the Hawker Sea Fury? Your perspective is part of the story. Share your thoughts, your experiences, or the veterans you remember. And if you value the lessons history leaves behind, stay with us as we continue exploring the machines and decisions that shape the world. The battles may be over, but their echoes still teach us how to understand the past and the future that follows.